Hello, I'm R.A. Spratt. I write and perform this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, I'm a children's author, so you can buy a book by me, or you can buy me a coffee by going to buymeacoffee.com/storiesrasprat. It's an easy way to make a small thank you gift to the show so I can keep kicking this can down the road. The podcast directory you're using right now should have a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the show notes, or you can type it into your browser. That's buymeacoffee.com/storiesrasprat. All contributions are gratefully appreciated. Hello and welcome to Bedtime Stories with me, R.A. Spratt. Okay, well, it's a lovely cloudy day here in Bowral. I'm at home in my office with Bobby the dog. He's nearly a year old now, and he's getting better at sitting quietly while I record these podcasts. Today, we're going to be continuing on from last week's episode. So the story we're doing is the story of how Nanny Piggins first met Boris back in the day when she was at the circus in South America, against her will, really. And anyway, I won't tell you anymore, but we're going to pick up where we left off. We might even sort of go back a little bit so you can hit the ground running with the story. So last time we ended with she could hear crying. She went back to her tent after a performance and she could hear crying and everyone else is asleep. So she goes off with a box of tissues to find whoever it is that's crying. So we're picking up the story in chapter 17 from the book Nanny Piggins and the Origin Story. Here we go. Like any compassionate person, Sarah hated the sound of crying, especially when you can hear clearly that the person crying doesn't have any tissues. It's a type of distinctive, very wet crying that is unpleasant for the person crying, but even more so for the hearer. Sarah grabbed a box of tissues and went in search of this poor, suffering individual. Her own tent was at the far edge of the circus, because it often took her a long time to walk back home after being blasted out of the cannon. By the time she got back, the show was long finished, and all the other circus performers were always in bed, so they gave her a tent on the far edge of the circus grounds so she wouldn't disturb anybody. Now you may be thinking, but getting into bed doesn't make a lot of noise, and that is true. Normally it doesn't. But Sarah would always come home to the circus smelling of gunpowder, and often the unpleasant odour of whatever she had landed in. One time she landed in the skunk enclosure at the zoo. One time she landed in a dumpster full of recently thrown out rotten eggs. And one time she made a splash landing in a slurry pit at a dairy farm. In case you don't know what a slurry pit is, it's basically what a dairy farmer calls their giant cow toilet. So when Sarah got back to the circus each night, before she went to bed, she would always have to take a shower. Again, a shower is not normally a noisy activity. Circus performers lead busy, physically active lives, so they're usually tired enough to sleep through the sound of someone turning a shower on. The problem was, the ringmaster didn't believe in hot water. Having a hot water tank and attaching a heat source would cost money, and the ringmaster did not believe in spending money. As a result, after trudging back to the circus and getting into the shower, Sarah would find herself suddenly assaulted by ice-cold liquid, which would make her scream in shock, then in rage, then in descriptive threats of what she would do to the ringmaster when she got hold of his shin. And these screams did disturb the sleep of the other performers. So Sarah's tent was down the back, near a creek that she could jump into to wash before going to bed. The only other tent nearby was the storage tent, where the ringmaster kept all the worn-out safety gear that he needed to produce if they were ever visited by the Occupational Health and Safety Inspector, and spare barrels of gunpowder that he needed to hide if they were ever visited by the Occupational Health and Safety Inspector. It was from this tent that Sarah could hear the sobs emerging. She lifted the entry flap and stepped inside. It was very dark, but her eyes were accustomed to that, thanks to the 2-hour cross-country hike she had just endured. Sarah could make out the shape of a large crate in the corner of the tent. The crying was definitely coming from that crate. "Hello," she said. "Are you all right?" Clearly, whoever was inside was not all right, but it seemed a politer way to strike up conversation than saying, "Good gracious, what horrible ordeal have you endured?" Apart from anything else, this person was in a crate. Things were clearly not going well for them. The occupant of the crate whimpered and stopped crying quite so loudly. They sniffled and continued crying as quietly as possible. "It's all right," said Sarah. "I'm not going to hurt you. You just sounded so upset. I thought you might like a chocolate bar. I know I always want a chocolate bar when I'm that upset. I don't actually have a chocolate bar right now, but if you like I can let you out and we can go and find one together. The Ringmaster always has chocolate biscuits in his caravan. We can break in and look for them. What do you say?"
"Yakachudamai,"
mumbled the voice in the crate. Then he started crying again. "I beg your pardon," asked Sarah.
"Yakachudamai, mir strajna,"
he sobbed. "Either you have suffered a blow to the head that has caused a stroke that is making everything you say utterly unintelligible, or you are speaking in a foreign language," said Sarah.
"Мне нравится коробка,"
said the voice sadly. Sarah had no idea what this poor creature was saying, but she understood the sound of despair, and there was despair in that voice. Also, he was in a crate, so it was easy to understand why he was unhappy. Sarah knew just how unpleasant it was to be nailed into a wooden crate. "Don't worry, I'll get you out of there," she said. "Just hang on a moment. I'll need some sort of tool." Sarah hurried back to her own tent to fetch a wooden spoon. When she returned, she jammed the handle of the spoon into the ring of the padlock, then used all her strength to lever it up. The wooden spoon snapped, which really irritated Sarah because it had been a good wooden spoon. She'd baked many a cake with it. Now she was starting to get teary too. Then a brilliant idea occurred to Sarah. If she wanted to open the lock, she was standing in a tent with 25 large barrels full of extra bangy gunpowder, and that gunpowder wasn't just good for blasting pigs, it was also handy for destroying things like locks. Even though Sarah was exhausted from a long day of being a megastar, she took the precaution of dragging the crate out into the middle of a field. Blowing up a lock right next to 25 barrels of gunpowder might trigger an explosion so large it would take her a month to walk back to the circus. Once in the field, Sarah took a small amount of gunpowder and tipped it into the mechanism of the lock. "It would probably be a good idea if you went to the far side of the crate now," Sarah advised the poor weepy creature within.
"Я понятия не имею, что ты мне говоришь,"
the voice replied. Sarah tucked a fuse into the keyhole, lit it, and ran to hide behind a nearby boulder. 3 seconds later, kaboom! Shredded pieces of crate flew over Sarah. When all the bits had safely landed, she popped her head up from behind the boulder. But she couldn't see anything, because the next second, a wild animal had latched itself to her face. At first, Sarah assumed she was being attacked, but she soon realised this was not the case. She was, in fact, being hugged. It took her a moment to figure out by what, because in the dark it was hard to see when there was an animal attached to your face. But she soon discovered she was being hugged by a tiny bear cub. He was trembling with fear and clinging to her desperately. "Everything's going to be all right," Sarah assured him. "Explosions are loud, but there's no better way to totally destroy something than a big bang, and I know from experience that crates are horrible, so they're better off destroyed." The bear just started crying again. "Come along. I don't think a chocolate biscuit is going to cut it," Sarah decided. "You need chocolate cake. Come to my tent and I'll bake you one." The bear cub didn't so much come along as stay attached to her face as she walked back. "Is everything okay, Sarah?" Rosalind called out from her tent. "Did I hear an explosion?" "Oh, yes, but only a tiny one. Nothing to concern yourself about," Sarah assured her. Once Sarah got the bear cub inside her tent, he did not want to let go of her. Thankfully, after months of working in the circus, Sarah had grown incredibly strong. Walking back after being blasted and chasing the Ringmaster around and stomping on his feet when he was wicked, which was all the time, was intensive exercise. So she was able to prise the bear's fingers off one at a time. It was late, and Sarah only had limited ingredients. The Ringmaster refused to provide Swiss chocolate in quantities that she felt were reasonable. So she had to make do with the basics: flour, eggs, butter, sugar and cocoa to make her chocolate cake. It smelled wonderful, but the hens must have been having a bad day when they laid the eggs, because the cake itself was a little bit dry. Normally, she would have solved that problem by smothering the cake in icing or cream, but she had none. She did, however, have a small jar of honey, and Sarah thought that a thick layer of that would help make the cake more moist. As soon as she opened the jar, the bear cub stopped crying.
"Чё это? Это самый чернецкий замат назвать?"
Sarah drizzled the honey over the top of the cake, cut a big slice, and handed it to the little bear. The bear did not seem to know what to do with it. He sniffed it carefully, his little nose twitching as he inhaled each breath. Sarah mimed eating it to give the young bear the idea of what he was meant to do. but he just looked confused. So Sarah cut a slice for herself and demonstrated. She held it up to show him and took a really big bite. It was spectacularly good. She couldn't help but close her eyes and savour the delicious flavour combination. It was divine, splendiferous, awe-inspiring, magnifique. Sarah was just about to open her eyes and cut another slice when she heard a noise. It was a type of guzzling, chomping sound. Sarah opened her eyes to see the poor little bear cub shoveling his whole slice of cake eagerly into his mouth with 2 hands. "Oh, you like it, do you? Wonderful," said Sarah. "Would you like another slice?" Even though the little cub could not understand the words she was saying, he seemed to instinctively understand the language of cake. His eyes gaped with delight, his hands clasped with joy, his head nodded with agreement. Sarah cut him another big slice and passed it to him, and the tiny bear ate it so quickly she was seriously concerned he might accidentally bite off his own finger. Between the two of them, the cake was finished in less than a minute, and they were both happier by then. The cub had stopped crying altogether. He got to his feet and wriggled a little bit. He must have been all scrunched up from spending goodness knows how long in that horrible crate. He stretched out one leg and pointed his little toes. Then he stretched his other leg and pointed those toes. Then he raised one arm in the air. Now, listener, I know this all sounds tremendously mundane, but it wasn't. There was something about the way this little bear performed those simple gestures. It was magical. Even though he was a short little bear, covered in brown fur, with powerful but undeniably chunky legs and an ample belly, he had grace and elegance of the like Sarah had never seen before. Just raising his arm above his head was like a work of art. His hand turned just so, his back arched elegantly as he looked at his raised hand, like he was looking at a beautiful sunset. Then he squealed with joy, leapt high in the air, and did a perfect pirouette. And it was as though he had spoken words. Sarah knew exactly what he had said, even though he had only spoken through dance. And his dance said, "That cake was delicious." "I'm so glad you liked it," said Sarah. "It's always a pleasure to bake for someone who really appreciates a good cake. It's very late and we should be going to bed, but would you like me to make you a cup of hot chocolate, with perhaps a drop of honey in it before you go to sleep?" The young bear looked at her in puzzlement. Evidently he had not understood a word. "Oh dear," said Sarah. Then it occurred to her how she might be able to communicate with him. If this bear was fluent in expressing himself through dance, perhaps he might be fluent in understanding another through dance. So Sarah began to dance herself. She danced a little dance about a brilliant and impossibly beautiful pig who was exhausted after a long day of cannon blasting. Her dance went on to tell the story of how she'd been awoken from her troubled slumber by the sound of unhappiness in another, how they had shared a wondrous cake, and now, as a gesture of love and fellowship, she was offering to make him a beverage made of milk from a cow and bee regurgitation. The bear watched her every move with rapt intensity. When she finished, he clutched her to his chest and exclaimed, "Da, da, da!" Sarah took this to mean yes and set to work. By the time the little bear had finished his hot chocolate with honey, he was humming with delight. It was a joyous tune. As he hummed, he pointed his little toes and flutter-kicked his feet with pure happiness. "Well, we'd better go to bed," Sarah told him. Again, the poor wee bear had no idea what Sarah was saying, so she quickly did a dance demonstrating what she meant. She danced the story of a content young pig going to bed after a lovely time making a new friend. The little bear got the gist of the dance quickly and joined in. His dance depicted a tiny bear overwhelmed to be in a new environment, but delighted to befriend an impossibly glamorous pig. He danced the way Shakespeare spoke, beautifully, although, if anything, much better than Shakespeare, because unlike Shakespeare, he didn't throw in a bunch of forsooths, art thous, and hark these. Every word he spoke through dance was expressed with clarity that was as clear as a bell. "You are a dear little thing," Sarah told him, "but we will not always be able to talk purely through dance. I'd better teach you a few words of English." She pointed to herself and said, "My name is Sarah." He looked confused. She repeated, "Sarah." The little bear scrunched up his forehead with concentration as he tried to decipher her sounds. "Sarah," she said again. The bear still looked confused, but he tentatively pointed his claw at her and said uncertainly, "Sarah?" "Yes, that's right," she said, beaming happily. "I am Sarah. And you?" She pointed at his chest. The bear looked confused. Sarah pointed at herself and said Sarah again. Then she pointed at him and looked questioningly. He was still confused. So she got up and expressed it in dance. She danced a bow of introduction, bowing low and presenting herself to him while saying, Sarah. Next she danced a dance of query, raising both hands to him, urging him to speak. The bear seemed to understand what Sarah was getting at. He pointed at his own chest. Sarah nodded encouragingly, and he shyly spoke one quiet word. Boris. Boris, Sarah said, it is a pleasure to meet you. I have a feeling that you and I will be firm friends. I used to have 13 identical 14-uplet sisters and one no-good brother who I currently miss far more than they deserve. I would be honoured if you would allow me to adopt you as my brother. I get the strong sense that I already like you far more than the rest of them put together. I realise it's traditional to not like your siblings, to simply love them instead, but I find myself wanting to have a brother I could actually like for a change. Dear, sweet Boris was, evidently, just as confused by this as he was by all her other words. But he got the sense that Sarah was being nice, because he responded in what Sarah was to discover was his second language, a language like dance in which he was a maestro. And that language was the language of hug. Boris gave Sarah the most wonderful bear hug experienced by a pig in all of history, and she hugged him right back. And that night, for the first time since she'd come to the circus, Sarah went to sleep, not feeling lonely. All right, well, we'll end it there. I hope you like that. If you do like that, those chapters are from Nanny Piggins and the Origin Story, which is available as a physical paperback book, or you can get it as an audiobook. I recorded the audiobook when it came out in 2024. Okay, well, that's it for now. Until next time, goodbye. Hello, it's me again. If you enjoyed listening to Bedtime Stories with R.A. Spratt, it would be really helpful if you could like, subscribe, follow, and or review the show on whatever podcast platform you're listening to now. Every little one of those digital affirmations helps, and the bigger this podcast gets, the more I can justify procrastinating from my real job to keep bringing these stories to you. Thank you.